This video is a very brief introduction to Chapter 2, Classes and Formatting. So what are data classes? Well, it's a way to be able to specify the kind of data that you're working with, whether it's dates, whether it's qualitative or character values, or whether it's numeric data, so on and so forth. But it's important to be able to specify precisely what class your data are comprised of in order for your spreadsheet software, whether it's Excel or whether it's Google Sheets or something else, in order for it to be able to treat your data in the desirable way. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's talk about quickly how to jump into the formatting wizard. You can simply, in this number tab, click on number format, and it opens up this format cells box, and here you have a series of different data classes that you can select for your data. In this case, these are clearly numeric data. It's the number of unique words for these given artists. And I'm not going to choose number, though. I'm going to assign it as text. Well, what's going to happen when I try to use the function sum? And in those parentheses goes all of these values, which are clearly numeric for us, but we've told Excel that they are text values. Nothing happens. And that's because you're essentially running into a sort of error, because these are in fact text under the hood, and Excel is treating them as such. It wouldn't make sense if these were, for example, zip codes, and you're trying to find the average of all of these different zip codes that you put together, or some other mathematical or arithmetic operation. So we can't, in the same way that we can't treat text mathematically, at least usually, there are ways, Excel cannot treat these mathematically either, unless we specify that it is in fact a number. So what do we do? In the format wizard, we can specify the number of decimal places in the class numeric or class number. In this case, they're called categories. And we can also indicate whether or not we want a thousand separator, which is a comma. And in some countries as well, when we consider them, of course, it is represented by a period. And so that's something to keep in mind. So what about qualitative data? Well, we've already seen how to turn data into text, but it's good to be able to designate qualitative data or text data or character data as that particular class, and to be treated as such. Oftentimes you have, for example, a zip code or a year. In fact, we actually have this variable era, and of course, these artists existed, started and stopped their careers all throughout the 1990s. And so those would be dates, years like 1991, 92, 93, etc. And this is totally different from that, because it's actually telling us the category of the decade, which we've labeled era here. And so these should be treated as categorical values and not as kind of numeric values like 1991, 1992. This makes more sense when you look at this as if we included 1980 and 1980 and 1970 as another decade. So not all numeric values, not all numeric values should be treated numerically, but rather as text or as categorical. What's more, we also have proportions here. And so a proportion is a number between 0 and 1, essentially the same thing as a fraction. And you can also convert that to a percentage and then indicate how many decimal places you want. So there we go. That's much more legible and much more decodable and understandable and interpretable for us by changing this from a proportion to a percentage. And also, when you create your data visualizations, you'll want to be able to show, for example, a percentage rather than a proportion, because it's much more easy. It's much easier for audiences to be able to interpret percentages rather than proportions. So what else? Well, we have date variables as well. And so this is a particular class often called DateTime, especially when it is including a time. And Excel does recognize these, and you can change the format of them. So in this case, we can change it to the year, the month, and then the date, also known as International Standard Format or ISO format. And this allows essentially these data to be easily communicated to data scientists and analysts who always use ISO format, or for the most part use ISO format, all over the world, that is. So those are date variables. We can also, of course, change those formats to something else. This is kind of interesting because Excel will actually know the weekday of January 1st, 1979. In this case, it's a Monday. It happens to be a Tuesday. It happens to be a Friday in 1982. So Excel looks into its internals and will be able to format that date appropriately. Now, there's also geospatial or geo classes. You can specify those in Google Sheets, but you cannot specify those in Microsoft Excel. And so what to do? Well, there's really no way to specify it in this format wizard because there's no class that exists for it, as you can see. However, it doesn't mean that it's not recognized as a geospatial or geo class. So how do we know that? Well, if we choose Insert and we choose a recommended chart, it does actually convert this into these states and then the number of platinum albums per state. So that's kind of interesting. So keep that in mind, that it can recognize geospatial variables, latitude and longitude coordinates, other kind of geographic areas, or in this case, country or state codes as well. So do keep that in mind, that even though you can't designate it explicitly, Bing, which is, I believe, Microsoft's search engine, does allow you to be able to create geospatial visualizations and recognize that variable. Lastly, we have essentially logical variables, or class logical, which can also be considered as binary. So what's a logical? Well, if you have a condition and that condition is met, then it is true. If it is not met, it is false. And those are the only two values you can really have in a logical statement, aside from, of course, missing values. So what are we looking at here? Well, in this case, the variable Wu-Tang is telling us whether or not the artist belonged in, at any time, the Wu-Tang Clan. So in GZA, that happens to be true. Everyone else is false up until Raekwon, and who's considered true. And of course, who can forget Method Man as well. I'm sure the pudding's down with ODB, but the thing is I'm not sure he had enough lyrics to hit the 35,000 word mark. And so that was unfortunate. But if you're familiar with Wu-Tang Clan, these are actually the top 15 largest vocabularies, starting from greatest to least, in the 1990s. And so it's no surprise to see 3 members of the Wu-Tang Clan there. But why are logicals really awesome? Well, under the hood, again, they're represented by true is 1 and false is 0. And that allows us to be able to treat logicals as mathematically. So in other words, if we were to find the sum of all this in binary, it would give us the number of trues. In other words, the number of Wu-Tang Clan members in the data set that we have here. And what's more, instead of using sum, we can use function average. And average is going to give us the proportion, which we can of course change to percent, the proportion of members in this list, 3 out of 15, that comprised Wu-Tang Clan members. So that's also an interesting way that you can treat binary. Again, you would specify this as a number, but there's really no way to explicitly call this binary in Microsoft Excel. That is not true, at least for logical values, in Google Sheets, which you can specify. So lastly, there are shortcuts when it comes to formatting. So we did look at, for example, how to turn proportions into percentages, but as I just showed with the Wu-Tang and logical values example, you can use shortcuts up here, again in this number panel. So if we click on percent, that will give us or that will automatically format the proportion into a percentage. We can also use the decimal left and decimal right to be able to change and adjust these the number of decimal places. And so you can do that rather conveniently. And there's that shortcut right here on the menu. And what's more, we can do the same thing with numeric data. So let's convert this back to general. And so now we can actually click on number and change this to, instead of going through that wizard, we can simply click on this comma. That automatically inserts the thousand separators, converts this or specifies it as a numeric variable and sets that class, lets Excel know that it is indeed a number. And what's more, we can get rid of those not necessary decimal places. And lastly, even though this doesn't really make sense to do with our data, we can click on the shortcut to make it money. So that's money right there. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you found it useful to be able to format data. It's not entirely complex, but again, I cannot overemphasize the fact that you need to be able to specify what kind of data you're working with, because Excel, even though sometimes it tries to guess, won't always know. And that's the same with Google Sheets. And the reason that's really important in the context of this workshop is that ultimately it's going to influence how your variables and how your values appear in your data visualizations. And that's probably the most important part. So that all being said, welcome to formatting, and I'll see you in the next chapter.